Welcome back. In our last lecture, we looked at the reign of William the Conqueror, and we concentrated mostly on what William had to do to consolidate his conquest of England. He had to cope with rebellions, certainly, and one of the ways he did this was to make a whole-scale redistribution of lands to his supporters. He essentially created a new elite in England. But he left most of the lower layers of the social hierarchy largely as they were. For many English people, the most important immediate result of the Norman conquest is that they get a new lord. But that was just the start of the process of creating a new society, a blend of English and Norman. And in this lecture, I want to talk in a little bit of detail about what this process is like. How do English and Normans deal with one another? So we'll look at the legal implications of the conquest, but we're also going to look at the social and cultural effects of the conquest. How do people interact with each other? How are they affected on a personal level by the change of regime? In this lecture, we're going to use a variety of very different kinds of sources to answer these questions. The first one we'll look at is the famous Doomsday Book, and we're going to spend quite a bit of time on Doomsday Book. This is an amazing work. It includes all sorts of information about land and people in England under William the Conqueror. It'll tell us a lot of hard facts. It'll tell us how many plows there are on the estates of the Bishop of Lincoln in Huntingdonshire. But we're also going to look at chronicles and other sources to get a feel of what post-conquest England is like. So that's the plan for this lecture. Let's start with Doomsday Book. It's really two books, one very large book and one smaller book, but they go together. And they contain information about English lands. It's organized county by county. And then within each county chapter, there are entries for the lands of each major landholder in that county. That's the basic setup of Doomsday Book. Now, it's an extremely complicated document, and it's very controversial. Many books have been written about it, and scholars disagree about almost everything to do with it, including the very basic question of what it's supposed to be for. We can't be completely sure what the point of Doomsday Book is. Why was it made? Some scholars think the king is trying to pave the way for imposing a new kind of tax, so he wants to know, how do you assess the tax throughout England? Some people think he's trying to square away who has the right to different estates. We'll deal with this question a little bit later in the lecture. But first, I want to describe what Doomsday is and how it was compiled, and then we'll try to figure out why it was compiled and what it was used for. The first thing to say is Doomsday Book is an amazing resource. If William the Conqueror did anything that modern historians bless him for, it was ordering the compilation of Doomsday Book in 1086. Now, of course, William doesn't call it Doomsday Book. That's a nickname given to it a bit later, because people come to feel that the information in Doomsday Book is destined to last until the end of time, hence Doomsday. But William isn't thinking about the end of time. He's thinking about right now. He needs information, for some reason, we are not exactly sure why, and he sets up a very elaborate process to get that information. Here's what a later chronicler says about what William wants to know. He wants to find out how many hides of land there are in England. Remember, a hide is a unit of land notionally meant to support a single family. He wants to know how many hides of land the king has and how many hides the various barons and bishops have. And here it's important to remember the church owns a lot of land. The king also wants to know, what are these lands worth? How much revenue can they bring in? And also, this is quite interesting, he wants to know what these lands used to produce in the time of King Edward the Confessor. And this is a way of getting at how the economy has changed after the Norman conquest. Essentially, the king wants to know everything he can about the productive capacity of England. How rich are we? What do we really have? Now, this level of detail made a very big impression on people at the time. Nothing like this had ever been attempted before. And in a later chronicler's description of this, you can hear a sort of sense of amazement about the Doomsday Project. He wrote, So thoroughly was all this carried out that there did not remain in the whole of England a single hide of land, or an ox, or a cow, or a pig that was not written in that brief. You can almost get a sense that this chronicler is a little bit oppressed by this. He's sort of feeling as if this is Big Brother going a bit too far. But you can't help but be impressed by how William went about getting all of this information. He mobilized literally hundreds, probably thousands of people who all worked to create the final product. The first step is to create commissions. These are small groups of officials who are assigned to a particular part of England. That's their territory that they're going to cover. And these areas are called circuits. And each one was made up of a group of counties. There were 7 of these circuits, and they're organized to make sense geographically. For example, Circuit 2 is made up of 5 counties in the southwest: Wiltshire, Somerset, Dorset, Devon, and Cornwall. This is a pretty coherent territory. Circuit 7 is made up of 3 counties in the east: Norfolk, Suffolk, and Essex. The idea clearly is that these are parts of the country that form a unit, and that makes sense. Okay, you're a doomsday commissioner. You've just been told you're doing Circuit 7. Actually, they wouldn't have been told that exactly. These numbers have been assigned to the circuits by modern scholars. So you've been told your job is Norfolk, Suffolk, and Essex. Go find out everything you can. What do you do next? Well, you go off with the firm intention of taking full advantage of all of those elaborate administrative structures that were set up by the Anglo-Saxon state. The counties, the hundreds, all of that we covered in a previous lecture. So the commissioners go to each county by turn, and in each county, they convene juries of local men from each hundred, each subdivision of the county. And they ask the jurors a series of questions about the land in that hundred. And the idea is that people in each local area are going to know who owns what land and what it's worth. There's probably some sort of basic questionnaire that the commissioners are working from. It varies a bit from circuit to circuit. In some places, they clearly asked more questions about livestock than they did in others. But essentially, they're after the same information. The basics I mentioned before. Who owns what land? Where is it? How much is it worth? One of the most interesting things that the juries were asked is, how much was the land worth in the past, and how much is it worth now? And they expressed this based on the king who was ruling at the time. So the value of the land in 1066 is called the value in the time of King Edward. The value in 1086, at the time the survey was done, that's in the time of King William. So you have a record of how values have changed during this very eventful 20-year period. I mentioned in the last lecture that you could actually trace the effects of the harrying of the North, the results of the Northern Rebellion. Doomsday Book is where you can do that. There are places where the value in the time of King Edward is much higher than the value in the time of King William, because those areas have not yet recovered from all of the looting and burning that was done at that point in the reign. On the other hand, there are plenty of areas where the values went up. So there's not a consistent pattern across England of how land values change. The economy is fairly localized. Lots of factors go into determining if an area is going to grow or not. But one big thing that helps is not having an army troop through your lands. So the juries provide quite a lot of information. Probably they did have some written records to go on. These are records kept at the hundred level and the county level. These records don't survive, but we can tell from Doomsday Book that there have to have been some written sources to provide this level of detail. But there were some questions that couldn't be answered just by looking them up in a document. The juries were also asked to pronounce on some controversial questions, like who really had title to a particular piece of land in the neighborhood. There might have been a dispute about that. Perhaps it stretched back many years. One of the interesting things in Doomsday Book are the places where the jurors claim ignorance. They simply say, we don't know who has the right to that particular estate. Now, one modern scholar, I think, has made a very convincing argument about what's happening here. The jurors don't want to go on record one way or the other because they're caught between a rock and a hard place. They have to live in this neighborhood after the Doomsday Commissioners leave, and they're going to be rubbing shoulders with the two people who are having the dispute. So it's safest to just say, we don't know. So I think this gives us a sense of the wonderful complexity of post-conquest England. On the one hand, you've got this very sophisticated administrative machinery. You can actually go out and mobilize these juries all over the country to provide this detailed information. But on the other hand, sometimes these people are scared to death of their neighbors. So this is both assimilation and conflict at work. So the juries have now testified. Now, you, the commissioners, gather up the information. It's on lots of separate sheets of parchment called briefs. And these briefs are gathered up, they're brought back to a central location, and ultimately they're used to create Doomsday Book. And we can tell that the scribes of Doomsday Book abbreviated the information in the briefs. There was originally even more detail than we have now. We know this because there are other documents made from the briefs that do have more detail. Clearly, the Doomsday Book scribes figure that if they put in everything, nobody's going to be able to lift the final product. So the work of the commissioners is done. We know what Doomsday Book is, we know how it was compiled. But why was it compiled? That's a question. I'm not going to go into too much detail. As I've said, historians have gotten very exercised about this. I'm just going to give you the main theories, and then we're going to leave the question open. Some historians think that the king wanted to gather all of this information because he wants to impose a new kind of tax in England. He's going to use a new unit called the ploughland. That's the theory. But the information in Doomsday Book is not organized in the best way for collecting taxes. It's listed within each county by landowner. This means if you want to hit up individual landowners who own land in more than one county, which is very commonly the case, you have to look at the information in more than one county. It's very cumbersome. But the biggest problem with this argument is also the fact that the method of collecting taxes wasn't changed. So it's a lot of trouble to go to and then change your mind about wanting to do it. One of the most interesting theories ties Doomsday Book to the famous event that took place in August of 1086 at Salisbury. This is the occasion I mentioned in the last lecture when King William gathers all the leading men of the kingdom and has them swear an oath of loyalty directly to him. One historian has argued that the king extracted the oath in exchange for Doomsday Book, because Doomsday Book was a register of who really had the right to the land. And this was something that was going to help people feel secure in their title to land. It's a quid pro quo. You promise to serve me loyally, I'll ratify title to your land. Other historians have pointed out, though, that by this point, 20 years into the reign, most people are pretty secure about how their title is. After 20 years, some of the people who swear the oath at Salisbury are actually the sons of the first people to get the land. It's already been inherited once. So people aren't really that worried.